Welcome everyone. This is going to be a demonstration using India ink and watercolor. We can obviously see it's going to be a bunch of radishes. And I'm going to start us off with a drawing. The drawing is very loosely applied with 2H pencil. And that's literally just to give me a roadmap. You don't have to do a drawing in this particular case. You could sit down and draw with this improvised pen tool. It's made out of a pop can and shaped in such a way that you can dip it into India ink just like you might a regular quill. The benefit here is the sharpness of the line contrasted with some really thick crude marks that you can get. So it has the benefit of being super delicate and fine control, but also allowing you to lose control at times. It lays down a really nice dark passage of ink where there's no translucency, you just solid black, and it can shape this line so I can be really precise there and mirror that original line that I have. So my photograph here is a bunch of radishes I set up in my studio. I was looking for strong light and dark because I was going to take advantage of this drawing instrument using some solid blacks in there and trying to find a good balance of the lights against the darks. My edges are going to be irregular at times, and I'll take advantage of that, maybe even feather an edge out, but really focusing right now on drawing the map out, essentially, for where the color is eventually going to go. There's going to be issues that come up where your mark doesn't do exactly what you want it to, and you have to work around it. In comics, sometimes the best benefit is to just make it black. And so relative to the subject matter that I've set up, going in and blacking in an area that may have gotten a little fussy, it's not a bad thing necessarily. It can re-inform what your main figure is, in this case the red of the radishes. And I really just love that contrast of thick and thin, especially on this area where I'm working right now. Just crazy thin lines. You double it up with another stroke nearby, you build some rhythm. Throw that black in there completely, and it's just this abstract design that's compelling. And through that abstraction, we eventually find some element of realism. The location of the light versus the dark informs the whole drawing before I ever get any color into it. So I'll continue moving around and being aware of what's laid in pretty heavy and thick so I don't run my hand into it. But my hand is pretty far away from the surface. The general idea with this drawing instrument is to not stab into the paper if you can help it, but let it scrape across it. So I've turned the sound down here on the demo, but it is a relatively obnoxious sound if you're working around other people or even for yourself. So if you hate the sound of chalk on a chalkboard, you may not like this. But there are certainly other things that you could find. You could go grab a stick from the woods and dip that in and create some interesting lost and found edges that you hadn't initially planned, where they just kind of obliterate and gray out into a texture. So this will do something similar. I love the variety that it can provide that I wouldn't have normally been allowed to do if my brain was telling me what to do. So it really kind of lets me let go. And so in certain areas here, there's a lot of detail, a lot of little shapes. I'm going in and laying in what I can, but there will be a refinement to that to make sure that it's saying what it needs to say. But it's still just continually varying thick and thin around, finding a pair. Find a thick next to a thin, find a double line next to a single line, and promote that variety in the whole piece. Really working around the whole drawing, I'm trying to establish the big shapes, looking for what really is characteristic about each shape. If you can identify it as some other object, you can see a face in it, you can see an animal head in it. It can help you draw something that feels somewhat abstract at this point. but I'm continually looking at the spaces. How do they taper? How do they vary? And moving around the whole picture. So as I get it kind of resolved with the first pass, you start looking for the little moments that need to be darkened in, or the more detail-oriented things that need to be little veins in the leaves that wrap a cross contour on it. And I'm starting to think about some of those ways that the roots are going to be completed in the drawing of the watercolor rather than just the ink. So I've overlapped some of those roots into the radish, but I know some of it will be created with the white of the paper painted around by the watercolor. And we're nearing the end of this, so I'll just let it continue playing out for the next minute, and we'll come back with some watercolor. Final touches, and I'm going around and feathering the shadow out a little bit, casting shadows from some of the roots with a little bit of a hatch or a little scraping texture from the tool. And there's a good scan of the final line art before I apply the watercolor, which we'll do right now. And I'm using my co-primary color palettes with a warm and a cool of each of the primary colors. The nice thing about the smaller tray is that you have to refresh your paint, so it'll be more liquid and moist, easier to build up a more saturated mixture early on. Your watercolors can dry. Don't throw them away if they are dried up. You can reactivate them with water, but the juicy paint coming right out of the tube makes it easier to get that saturation point. So I'm mixing up a relatively large puddle so that it's able to kind of spread across a lot of the piece where it doesn't necessarily need to be recreated multiple times. So I'm pulling that second puddle away from it with a little more violet to start with that cast shadow. And I always like to go a little more saturated because I can always add water, as I've just done here, and shaping that edge a little bit with clear water that I dampen on a paper towel so it's not fluid, but just a little moist to soften the edge. And bringing a little bit of the Windsor Yellow and the Scarlet Lake together, there's a brownish area on the radish that wants to just be a little bit brighter, and I'm going to circle that with my red-violet color, playing with where those edges meet and cross and where they might leave a harder edge. I like a little bit more spontaneity in this technique, allowing the drawing to have some power and the conversation with the painting to be a little bit more on the same level, where the painting isn't going to be 100% representational. There's shape to it, there's bleeds to it, there's blurs to the edges, and the paint kind of separates at times. So I want it to be effortless, if you will. So if it ever looks like I'm layering too many times, then I know I need to take a step back and look at it again, find a way to do it more boldly. So I really try to do this in only a couple washes, not trying to shape the form completely. Let our mind fill it in. We're getting a lot of form just between the light and the dark contrast, providing a little bit of blending of temperature. That back left radish has some violet, so it shapes around the corner a little bit. This bottom one has a little more violet at the base, near the point, and it's a little brighter on the left side. Really just trying to let the materials play and do what they need to do. Overall, this color palette is going to look complementary. It's got a red, violet, yellow, green overcast to it, but I'm using some other colors. If you're trying to be more limited about it, honestly, you would just mix up your red, violet and play with the complementary yellow, green mixed into it if you needed to darken, or adding some black to it to darken something up. So you sacrifice a little bit of hue variation, but you get a lot of unity in terms of how the colors are blending if you play with those complements with one another. My second layer here, pushing a little darker, obviously need to drop that radish behind, but there's some reflected light, as you can see in the photo. So I want to save the brightness down there. And I'm dropping some of that color into the shadows. I'll eventually adjust that a little bit because it was too similar to that red violet, but getting it started, getting that thinking started to unify it. You also notice that the board shifts around a little bit. Sometimes I'm lifting my board off of the tilt so that I can control where the bleed of the water goes. And at this point I want to jump into the greens. There will be another layer over top the radishes, but I need to start seeing how the overall piece develops and where is it going to be balanced. So I'm using sap green, I'm using the Winsor blue green and the Winsor lemon color. Those three things are the pigments in the background. And I'm starting gingerly, I'm moving around, leaving a lot of white space, seeing if I want to leave any of it empty. That's an aesthetic that I find interesting at times, and not always coloring book fill in everything, but pick and choose those moments for purpose. But I'm blending multiple colors, so there's a very yellow-green cast to this. I've got some closer to green. There will be some that lean a little more blue. There's a lot of variety as you look at the photograph. I'm trying to promote some variety with the color here as well. By the time I'm coming back to some of these areas, it's pretty dry, where I can layer it on top. But I want to be conscious of that. If I see that it's still liquid, maybe I want it to bleed and I'll just mark something near the base of the wash and let it bleed up into it. Maybe I want it to filter down and I want it to kind of obliterate what was already there. So play with the water. Let it do what it's going to do. Don't try to fight it. I'm not I'm making a few more small marks at this point, bringing in a thickness, an edge, making very specific moments. Do they change the overall feel of it? Not entirely. It's subtle for all intents and purposes. It's nearly finished, but I want to go in with that second layer over top of the radishes just to turn the form a little bit more. They were reading a little flat to me. I think there's an opportunity to push another shape in there if I look at it in hindsight, but for the most parts, it does what I need it to do. It's communicating the color, little variation to the coloring for interest. Grabbing some of that color into the roots. Now I'm going to bring in a little bit of blue, There's a rubber band. It's the Winsor blue-green, so it relates kind of in an analogous way to the greens in the background, but just kind of fills the color palette out a little bit more for me right now. And I'm using it in select moments around the shadow, some deeper moments in the greens. And one more go at pushing that middle radish just a little bit further. When I make that mark, I'll come back in with a rinsed out brush and just clean up that edge a little bit. So I'll let it feather out. So practicing that is extremely useful. And we're wrapping this one up. So small little moments, small little changes, seeing if I wanted any texture. Another stripe of dark here or there. And we're basically done. So I want to thank you all for watching. Hope you have some fun playing around with the technique. And I again look forward to seeing what you all create on this project.